At my husband's funeral, my phone buzzed. The soil had just fallen heavy on the cedar lid, and the rain was trying to find a way through the black umbrellas when the little vibration in my hand felt like a second body. I pulled the phone out with numb fingers and read the message before my brain could catch up. I'm alive. Don't trust our children. Those words hit like a wind that lifts the dead leaves from the yard and shows you the holes underneath. For a moment, I only saw Ernest, his face like worn leather, his laugh wrinkled at the edges, the way he folded his hands on his chest when he slept. The funeral band played the hymn softly. The pastor's voice blurred into the patter of rain, and the cemetery dirt still smelled of cut grass and the diesel of the gravedigger. Then I looked up and met my son's eyes. Charles stood too straight. Henry's expression was a blank he seemed to have practiced on the drive over. Jasmine had her hand on Charles's arm like she was holding a curtain in place. I read the text again. The number wasn't familiar. No name, just that short, impossible sentence. My mouth tasted like coins. We had been married 42 years. Ernest and I started with less than a workbench and a secondhand bicycle pump. We built everything else from there. A bike shop on Main Street that smelled of grease and rubber, a sagging porch that knew all our afternoons, 2 boys who learned early to carry a toolbox and to keep from asking for what they couldn't pay for. We were poor, yes, but not unhappy, the kinds of pockets of contentment that count. A hot cup of coffee shared when the shop was closing, the song he hummed while he fixed a stubborn chain, the way his hand would find mine on a cold evening and squeeze. Ernest was the steady kind. He read the paper every morning until the ink blurred, and sometimes he'd rock in his chair with his hands in his pockets just to make sure his fingers still worked. He loved me with the kind of steadiness that doesn't always look romantic on the outside. It shows in how he remembered the names of old customers, the way he kept scrap metal organized by color, the way he always had enough patience to show a child how to ride a bike. We were not people who kept score. When money was thin, Ernest would tighten his belt and whittle a plan. When I fell ill, he would sit up nights in a metal chair by my bed without complaining. He had a quiet fidelity that looked ordinary, but it held up under storms. Our boys, Charles the eldest and Henry the younger, were the closest things to Ernest in their childhoods. Charles had his father's hands, long, sure, calloused from tightening spokes. Henry had Ernest's grin and his softer ways, the one who'd rather hand you a cup of coffee than argue. For years, the shop was their playground and their classroom. We scraped and patched, and when we could, we took the boys to the fair and let them eat greasy fries and ride the tilt-a-whirl until their stomachs gave out. The town watched them grow. We watched them become the kind of hopeful, slightly awkward boys that let you imagine them staying small forever. Somewhere along the way, the smallness on our porch became an embarrassment to them. It didn't happen all at once. It began with a suitcase left in Charles's room, a new jacket he wore without thanking us for. Henry started staying out later, picking fights with me about little things, about how I kept the bills filed or where Ernest left the bike parts. They learned fast how the world opened for some people and closed for others. Money moved in like water, seeping under floorboards you thought were set. They met people who smelled different, who wore their successes like bright shirts. Jasmine came with a laugh that filled rooms and a way of telling a story where everyone came out looking better for having been there. She was not cruel. She was simply the sort of person who saw what she wanted quickly and arranged herself around it. I told myself for a long time that these were the usual small betrayals of sons wanting to be more than the life they were given. I told myself I should be proud. Then the bills began to look different. The shop, which Ernest had kept like a temple, started needing repairs he never mentioned. He said he would do them. He said he was fine. He was fine in the way a boat is fine until the night it finds a rock it can't see. For weeks before the accident, the air in our house changed. There were conversations that ended when I entered a room. I found receipts crammed behind his socks, strange amounts, names I didn't recognize. Charles started talking about selling things he should not sell. Henry began to bring food to the table without waiting for my blessing, as if in proving he could provide, he might hide something else. I remember one morning Ernest holding a small envelope like he was considering throwing it away and then tucking it back. He slept less, he hummed less. He left a note for me that said simply, "If anything happens to me, call O'Connell." He wrote it without his usual flourish and folded the paper like he was hiding it from himself. Then the phone calls, the hospital, how the world narrows down to the fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant when someone you love goes in a box and someone else decides whether they'll come back out. Ernest was in the emergency room after what they called an accident. They put tubes in him. They told me he had taken a bad spill. The doctors used words that slid past me like pebbles: internal bleeding, shock, coma. I sat in a plastic chair that hurt my back and held his hand. He didn't wake up enough to smile at me. Charles and Henry were there in the hospital like they had never left. They filled out forms with the kind of efficiency strangers use when they don't want to feel. They told a nurse the things to be told. They talked in the room about arranging the funeral. Henry kissed my forehead and said quietly, "We've got this, Mom." The words were a balm that felt also like tape over a crack. They were efficient because they were panicking, and panic often dresses itself in competence. The hospital bills started to arrive that week, and other things began to shift into motion. The insurance company called, which meant forms and signatures. The funeral home suggested a quick burial to give you closure. It all moved fast, too fast for my sense of how these things should go. The day they buried him, there was a strange kind of kindness and a strange kind of speed to the planning. There was a moment, sitting in the church pew, when I looked at the program and saw that someone had increased Ernest's life insurance weeks before. I didn't know who had signed the papers. I didn't know how they had managed to contact the right agent in such a short time. All I knew was that the check that would come later was now a presence in the room, a flat thing passing between the folds of a conversation. I don't say these things to suggest I didn't love my boys. I loved them fiercely and foolishly the way a parent does. I also loved Ernest and the watchfulness that comes from the two of us together. When the soil fell heavy on that cedar lid and the rain tried to stitch the air, the little vibration in my hand felt like a second body. I read the message again. "I'm alive. Don't trust our children." If this message is reaching you now and you are new here, if you want stories of survival and how ordinary people find courage in extraordinary wrongs, consider subscribing. I tell this because there may be someone listening who needs to know they are not alone. That day, after we left the cemetery and people went home to warm casseroles and condolences, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I barely tasted. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the way the wind caught the chime on the porch. Ernest's chair remained where he'd left it the night before, his jacket over the back, a pair of glasses on the arm. The whole house felt like a room where a conversation had been cut short. The message sat on the screen like an accusation. Its simplicity made it worse. Who would say such a thing? Who would want to unsettle a widow on a day that was supposed to contain sorrow and soft things? I scrolled through my contacts, hoping somehow the number would resolve into someone I recognized. Nothing. Anonymous. A voice without a face had just told me the person I loved was not the body in the coffin, and that I should not trust my own children. I told myself I was tired and that grief can make your head stitch weird patterns. I told myself that someone might be cruel. But the same week, there were other things. A bank statement with withdrawals I'd never authorized, a check from an insurance company with a name different from ours, an invoice for parts to the shop that never arrived. The shop itself, where Ernest had spent the best of himself, looked as though a storm had passed through. Tools were missing, locks had been replaced. The boys had told me that there had been a fire, that it had to be closed to inventory, and I believed them because there was smoke smell clinging to the rafters and because sometimes your own honesty is weaponized against you. I began to write things down, habit mostly. Ernest had kept a notebook where he wrote reminders. I took to writing notes in the margins of his one-time pages. There were dates, a list of names, and a scrap of paper with handwriting that was unmistakably his. Stephen, check this. At first, I thought he meant an employee or a part. Then I found an envelope marked emergency. Inside was a business card, neatly cut and placed as if waiting for the right moment. Stephen Callahan, private investigator. His number, a note in Ernest's hand that said, "Don't tell them," and a small folded scrap that said, "If anything, start by checking the bank." I took the card to the bank the next day. There is a certain shame that walks with you into institutions when you feel like someone has used your life like a piece of paper. The teller was young and apologetic. She couldn't release account details without my signature, but she could pull transaction logs and point out anomalies if I signed the right forms. There were withdrawals in small amounts over weeks, drip transactions, the kind that read like regular life. There was a bigger transfer the week before Ernest's accident, a shift from the business account, and then a new policy that had been taken out and signed. The handwriting on those forms matched none of ours, and the signatures were strange copies of our own. Someone had learned how to mimic us. At the shop, the lock on the supply closet had been changed. I turned the key, found drawers emptied, cabinets pried. The register shorted out with a flick of a switch. There's a peculiar loneliness to seeing the place that held decades of your life made casual. A bicycle stand with a child's scrape on the paint, a poster of a race Ernest had once won, parts catalogs with notes in the margins. These were the small things that marked a life. And now, in the margins, there were receipts for equipment we had not bought, signatures for tools that had disappeared into hands that weren't ours. I told Sergeant O'Connell, the only cop in town I trusted, because he'd once stopped to help when my tire went flat, and because he knew our faces. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the paper the bank had given me. He did what small towns cops do. He took in what could be taken, he made notes. He asked me how certain I was that Ernest hadn't made these decisions himself. It was a reasonable question. Ernest had been stubborn enough to take out a policy without telling me, perhaps. People make choices in private. But my unease had become a pattern. This didn't feel like a man making secret choices. It felt like someone else deciding for him. Then, a woman at the bank quietly approached me and told me that a man had been asking questions about our accounts in person a week ago. She remembered his voice and she remembered his eyes. He seemed nervous, she said, like he wanted to be sure everything was in order. When I asked who it was, she hesitated and then said, "The younger son, Charles, I think. He had someone with him, a woman." I sat in my kitchen until the light grew thin and the house began to whisper. Ernest's mufflerless laugh popped into my head, then Charles's smooth efficiency, then Henry's sudden silence. The text message sat on the screen and felt heavier. "I'm alive. Don't trust our children." The more I looked at it, the less a single meaning held. It could be a cruel joke. It could be a prank. Or worse, it could be a key. That night, I called the number on Ernest's envelope. It rang 3 times, and then a man's voice answered. "Callahan?" He spoke with a careful, watchful cadence, someone used to listening. I told him my name, my address, the name of the man in the casket. He didn't say much, but he did ask one steady question. Did Ernest ever express fear? He wrote, "If anything happens to me, call O'Connell," I told him. He told me to check his desk. He told me to watch the bank. He left something with Stephen's card. There was a pause long enough that I worried he'd hung up. Then he said, quietly, "I'll come by tomorrow. Don't touch anything." The next morning, Stephen Callahan arrived looking as if he had been carved out of rain and late trains. A plain coat, tired eyes, a notebook. He was younger than I had imagined, with the sort of weathered face that suggested someone who had listened for a long time. He had a small recorder and a camera and a way of moving that seemed practiced for keeping his hands visible and his motives plain. He sat at my kitchen table like a man who had spent too many nights in strange kitchens. I handed him the envelope Ernest had tucked away. He didn't touch it at first. He just scanned it with eyes that were trying to catch any stray tremor of deception. "You've got to understand," I said. "I want the truth of what happened to Ernest." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." He asked questions about the day at the hospital in the kind of voice that doesn't shout but doesn't let you hide either. He wanted times, names, little fractures of detail I had taken for granted. He pulled out a small notepad and wrote, "Insurance increase? When?" and "Shop lock change? Who has keys?" His questions were small drills, gentle but precise. When I told him about the message at the funeral, his face changed in that slow way men of his trade have, curiosity folding inward to calculation. "Did Ernest ever express concern about the boys?" he asked. I told him the note about O'Connell, the way Ernest had left things tucked, as if he wanted me to find them when I needed them most. I told him about the unusual receipts and the lock changed. I told him about finding a business card in a top drawer and the way the shop smelled the day I went back. He nodded and said, "Sometimes the loudest betrayal is the quiet one. People give themselves away with small things." He asked permission to look around the house and the shop. I gave it to him because at that point I felt like giving anything would be better than holding my bones in my chest like a secret. He moved through our life with hands that didn't disturb more than they needed to. He opened drawers gently, leafed through Ernest's notebooks, snapped a few photographs of the backs of bills and the underside of tables. When he reached the old radio on Ernest's workbench, he stopped and ran his hand over it. "Have you ever had someone tamper with this?" he asked. "No," I said, "but it was always old radio. Sometimes it crackles, though, when the weather changes." He made a small private note and then he went to his car. He rose with a look that was both professional and personal, as if he were two people at once, a man doing a job and a man who felt the weight of this house. I followed him out to the street where the rain had left the air washed and clean. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device and said, "I have some things. I don't want to scare you, but I think Ernest was worried enough to hire me before he died." The words fell like a stone thrown into a shallow pond. Ernest had been worried enough to hire someone? The idea that he had been keeping his worries close to his chest made me both proud and horribly ashamed that I hadn't seen further. He told me that he had been looking into a few things quietly because the boys had become distant and because Ernest had told him in a last trembling voice that he feared his life might be in danger. He said he didn't want to confront them and make things worse, Stephen said. He wanted paperwork. He wanted a trail, something that would outlast the talk. We sat in his car, the warm air from the heater fogging the windows, and he pushed a little recorder toward me. "I have conversations," he said, "recorded, discreet. It wasn't supposed to come to this." My stomach fell into a place I've never been comfortable describing. The recorder was small and ordinary, like a tape player you might use for interviews. He told me we should listen somewhere private. I sat in his passenger seat and watched the rain make small rivers along the windshield. He pressed the play button and static filled the small car. Then, faint at first and then clearer, two voices came through, one older, one younger. My brain tried to resist making them into my son's, but the shape of the voices, the cadence, the merciless way they spoke about arrangements I didn't understand folded my breath up. They were not speaking about the weather. They were speaking about making something happen. I couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was the thing that sat at the back of my throat and wouldn't move. The casualness, as if something cruel were simply a task to be completed. Stephen stopped the machine and looked at me over the recorder like he was asking for permission to go further. He didn't need to ask. I nodded. The recorder started again, and I heard, clear and terrible, a line I could not have invented because it was too precise, too melodramatic for fiction. We have to make sure he doesn't wake up. The car was suddenly very small. My hands went numb. I wanted to tell myself this was a fiction of grief, a mishearing, a cruel prank. But the voice on the recording matched what my eyes had been telling me for months, a pattern of transactions, of conversations cut off when I entered, of a man whose fear had been tucked away like a spare key. Stephen didn't press the issue with wild speculation. He turned off the recorder and closed his notebook. "We can take this to Sergeant O'Connell," he said. "We can get a warrant to get those accounts open. We can check purchases, who bought what and when. There are ways to follow the money. But you should know, once this goes public, lives change." I remember thinking then that my life had already changed, that grief had begun to pull me like tidewater. I remember feeling pity for the boys, the sons who had been my pride and then my bewilderment. But pity doesn't keep you warm at night when you think someone may have planned your husband's death. We made plans. Stephen promised to get copies of the recordings in clean form and to trace the paper trail. He said he couldn't promise everything would be as clear as we hoped, but he had ways to listen to what people said when they thought no one else was. He asked me if I had told anyone about the funeral message. I told him no. I told him everything I had found and everything I had suspected. He took careful notes and told me to keep the recorder safe and to keep my phone on. When I went back inside the house, the weight of the day returned. The bed still held the shape where Ernest had slept. The kettle wasn't yet warm. Outside, the oak tree that had given the boys their secret fort leaned its branches like an old shoulder. For the first time since this began, fear sat next to grief with an equal claim. The text message, which had been a wrenched, wayward thing in a public, solemn place, now felt like the hinge on a door I was about to open. That night, I crawled into bed and pressed my hand over my heart the way you smooth a paper when you want it to lie flat. I kept thinking of Ernest's handwriting, of the single folded note that said, "Stephen, check this." I thought of how he'd sat at the kitchen table days before and thumbed the envelope like a man remembering a foreign language. He had not had many enemies in life. His enemies were time and the small cruelties of a world that can be impatient with honest hands. For him to have sought help meant something beyond ordinary worry. It meant he had seen something he couldn't bear to say aloud. I slept a few fragments that night, as if someone had cut the ribbon on a spool and let it roll in small pieces across a lot. Dawn came with the sound of the neighbor's radio and the smell of rain on hot pavement. I got up and made coffee, 2 mugs, because habit dies harder than grief. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the phone. The screen still held that single message. "I'm alive. Don't trust our children." I read it out loud like a prayer, and in the small house, it sounded less like a prayer than a verdict. Then there was another buzz, this time an unknown call. I ignored it. There was comfort, perversely, in not knowing. But the number flashed again, and this time a name came with it. Stephen. He said he wanted to meet at the bank. He was quiet when he spoke, like a man who had been given a terrible trust. He told me he'd traced a chain of small purchases. Nothing dramatic yet, he said, but the breadcrumb trail of receipts leading to purchases in town that could only mean someone had been planning for costs that didn't fit ordinary life. He asked me to bring Ernest's notebooks and any old receipts I might find. I went through the house like a woman looking for bones. I found an old ledger tucked into the false bottom of his desk drawer. Fingers that had held tools for decades had written in it. Notations about work completed, a hand-drawn calendar of races Ernest had wanted to attend, and one line at the back that made the air go thin. If anything, look at the shop records. Charles, Henry, Jasmine. I don't know when the small, hard line of suspicion turns into the force of action. Perhaps it is when someone hands you a piece of paper with names on it and you no longer have room for the luxury of doubt. Maybe it's when a recording plays and a voice that could be your son speaks of making sure a man doesn't wake up. For me, it was all those small things crumpled together until the idea of sitting still was impossible. We agreed to move carefully. Stephen said that we needed to corroborate the calls, the purchases, the withdrawals. He said he would dig through bank statements, get the phone records, look into the insurance increase, and, if there was any merit to what Ernest had feared, bring it to O'Connell and see if the town's law would rise to meet what had been done. He said he had a contact at a lab that could test samples, and that exhumation was a thought they'd both prefer to avoid unless evidence demanded it. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I only knew I wanted to find out whether the man in the casket was the man Ernest had been. Before Stephen left, he paused at the door and looked at me in a way that tried to keep me from being brave and reckless at the same time. "If this is a hoax," he said, "we'll know. If it's not, well, you'll have something to hold and you won't be alone." There is a moment when action begins to look like survival. I packed a small satchel with Ernest's papers and a picture of him in his work apron. I kept the photo folded into my wallet like something that could remind me of the ordinary heart of the man I had loved. The house felt like a place someone had robbed of its future. The oak outside our porch creaked as if it knew more than I did. I walked past the shop and peered through the window into the gloom where a coat hung and a half-finished wheel leaned against the bench. I wanted to reach through the glass and feel the grease under my nails again. That afternoon, with the ledger and the recorder sealed in my bag, I went to the bank with Stephen. He spoke with a courtesy that opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. People listened to him. He had a way of making questions seem reasonable. He had a way of making the truth show its face out of politeness. When he handed over the recorder for transcription and the bank statements for review, the teller, who had the softness of someone who'd been up too often with babies, looked at me with a new kind of attention. "Someone else is looking at these now," she said. "We can flag them. We can keep an eye." It was small consolation, but it was what I needed. For the first time since the casket lid had closed, the thought of going back to that empty bed and pretending all was well felt like a betrayal of something deeper than grief. If Ernest had been scared enough to hire a private eye, then the path he had left for me would be one I owed him to follow. Stephen put his hand on my shoulder as we left the bank, like a man making an unspoken promise. "Don't tell them what you found until we know more," he said. "Sometimes people will panic and try to hide things. Let us move clean and careful." I nodded and thought of the way the message had rung in my hand like a second body's vibration. It had pulled me out of the community of the morning into a smaller, sharper world of questions. The text, at once private and public, was now a hinge we could use to open a door. The ledger, the bank statements, Ernest's scrawled note, these were the keys. That night, I sat at the sink and scrubbed at a saucepan Ernest had used for a stew the week before. My hands, trained by years of work, washed as if I could cleanse myself of the new hardness that had set into my ribs. The phone buzzed once more at dusk. I let it go to voicemail. The little light blinked insistently. When I finally played the message, it was Stephen's voice, clipped and practical, telling me to keep the house as it was and to meet him early the next morning at the shop. I fell asleep with the sound of the recorder in my head, a static hum like a coming storm. In the dreaming, Ernest was fixing the old bicycle in the yard, and the boys were children, and Jasmine was only a name in a future I had not yet been asked to understand. I thought of waking to a world that made sense again. I thought of waking to a world where the message on my phone had been a cruel joke. At dawn, when the town was still and the bakery oven sent the first smell of cinnamon through the street, I walked to the shop. The sign over the door sagged, and the bell, when I opened it, sounded like a small apology. Inside, the shop was still and held the past like a sleeping animal. Tools lay where Ernest had left them. The radio was softly playing a song he liked. The sun fell through the high window and lit particles of dust like little witnesses. Stephen was already there, and his face was set like a map he couldn't read. He had a stack of papers. "I listened to the tapes again," he said. "Clean them up. There's enough here to ask O'Connell to open an investigation." He handed me a printout of the ledger with notes in the margin. On the paper, in my husband's hand, the same neat tilt of letters spelled out a sentence I'd seen before. Underneath it, in a different hand, someone had written a name and a date. The gossip of small towns is a thing that travels differently than facts. I had felt it at the funeral, people offering condolences and a look that asked how I would manage. Now, the small gossip and the facts were about to meet. Stephen sat down on the old stool by the bench and opened his notebook. He told me he had followed a trail of purchases to a hardware store 2 towns over, where someone had bought solvents and a bottle that could be used for many things, but had a label he made a note of. He said this with the carefulness of a man who knew the law was both a sword and a sieve. He did not dramatize. He simply listed things like one might tell a doctor the symptoms: purchases, withdrawals, signatures that looked like ours but weren't exactly. He showed me a photograph, a grainy shop image of a man in a dark coat with his face partially turned, and another of a receipt with a name scrawled at the bottom. My mouth was suddenly dry. The photograph had the slouch of my son, the angle of his jaw. My hands shook so badly that Stephen reached out and steadied them without fuss. "Margot," he said, "we can take this to O'Connell now, or we can gather more. Your call." For a long moment, I sat and thought about Ernest, in his work apron, a man who fixed things not because he loved making things, but because he loved making things right. I thought about the message in my hand at the funeral, how it had turned my sorrow into a sharp edge. I thought about how Ernest had tucked that card in his drawer, like a small insurance against silence. The choice was both heavy and simple. Let the town tuck it away in condolence, or pull on the loose thread until the garment came apart. I told Stephen we should go to Sergeant O'Connell. I told him there were names and a recording, and that the man in my house had been my husband, and that I did not want to be the kind of person who let fear make her keep quiet just because the world suggested I should be gentle. He nodded and locked the shop, tucking the keys into his pocket with a care he was saving for something bigger than locks. As we walked down Main Street toward the police station, the town was waking. Mrs. Renner at the bakery looked up and frowned. The postman tipped his cap, and a dog barked at a broom. People going about the small chores of their days didn't yet know that certain small certainties in our town were about to be rearranged. I thought of Ernest's hands and the way he had taught our boys to hold a wrench so it would not slip. I thought of the idea that the ones who should protect you sometimes are the ones who decide you're an obstacle. At Sergeant O'Connell's door, we turned the knob and stepped into the bright little office that smelled of coffee and file folders. He looked up, surprised to see me standing there in my coat, my hair still dusted from the funeral, and then made the face that small-town cops make when a neighbor shows up with trouble in both hands. I told him everything I could without shaking out the whole story. I gave him the recorder. I told him about the ledger. I told him that a man in the bank had mentioned Charles and a woman. I handed him the business card. He listened in a way that made me feel like my words were being cataloged and saved. He did not make promises. He did not say the things people expect in movies. He said, in the way sober men do, "We'll look into it." Outside, the sun was higher and the town had filled up with the ordinary business of living. Inside, the small paper that had been shoved into my hand at the funeral lay like a splinter under my skin. "I'm alive. Don't trust our children." It had given me direction. It had made me feel foolish and fierce in equal parts. It had given me the difficult blessing of suspicion, which I would now have to use with grace. As we left the station, Stephen put his hand on my shoulder and said, simply, "Whatever comes, we will follow it piece by piece." He sounded like a man who understood both how stories end and how they begin. We walked back to the shop in something like silence, each of us holding our own small thoughts like coins. There are moments when you realize that life will go on whether you are ready or not. I realized that as I passed the oak tree with its worn branch that the boys had used to climb. I reached out and ran my fingers over the bark, feeling the old grooves. There was a long history pressed into that wood. Ernest's hands, the boys' laughter, the days of Greece, and the steady rhythm of our life. I pressed my forehead to the tree as if a person might be there, and I whispered Ernest's name so low I wasn't sure anything could hear it but the birds. We had started something. The message had been a match struck in dry grass. It had burned something open. It had promised a truth as dangerous as truth can be. I didn't know yet whether it would bring comfort or ruin, but I did know I could not sit down and let the air take the shape of what had been done to us. Stephen drove me home after that and left with a quiet promise to call. He closed his car door and the engine purred away, taking him out into a world that didn't yet know our small town had a wound. I stood in the doorway of our house and watched taillights disappear. Inside, the radio picked up an old song Ernest liked, and a memory rose so clear I could taste the day. Ernest leaning against the workbench, the smell of oil, the afternoon sun on his shoulder. He had once said to me, laughing, that life was mostly about fixing small things so big things wouldn't break. I thought about that all night, the way the phrase felt like a prophecy now. When I went to bed, I pulled Ernest's jacket across my knees. The jacket still smelled faintly of oil and soap and the man I had spent my life with. The message on my phone glowed one more time with a new string of letters, a number I didn't recognize, and a brief line. "If you want proof, meet me where we used to watch the races." The name wasn't on the message. It stopped at the place. The old track where, in summers gone by, Ernest and I would sit on a rusted bench and watch the boys race their bikes until their knees were scraped and their laughter was raw enough to sting. It was a place where time folded into itself, where, for an hour, the town was only speed and dust and the small idea that some things could last. I went because the instruction was simple and because the message had become a compass I could not set aside. The track was quieter now than it had been in its glory days. The stand sagged a little and the concession stand was painted a tired blue. The bench where Ernest and I used to sit was still there, its paint flaking like old bark. I sat and waited, with my hands folded in my lap, the cassette of grief looped and the recorder of suspicion ticking under everything. After a while, a woman I knew by sight came around the bend. Doris. Her hair was pulled back in the same practical knot she'd worn for 20 years. She kept her eyes on the ground at first, which is the way people near Revelation often begin, not wanting to meet the face that will change the story. When she finally looked up, I saw her resolve like a shape cut out and ironed. "You got the text," she said, and it was not a question. "I did," I answered. "I didn't think." "You shouldn't have been there," she said, the words blunt because she didn't have time for the soft ones. I shouldn't have sent it that way. But I thought if you'd seen it, you'd not sit waiting for others to pull you along. She sat beside me without asking, and for a minute we both watched the empty track like it was a stage, and some player would come out and speak the truth into the waiting rows. The light fell across the bench and made the old nailheads look like tiny suns. Doris folded her hands and handed me a small envelope. It had been left at her door the night before. "It wasn't yours to have yet," she said, "but after the funeral I couldn't go home and pretend not to know." Inside were photocopies, a grainy receipt from a hardware store 2 towns over, a small printout of a bank withdrawal that didn't look like anything either Ernest or I would have authorized, and a note in a hand that wasn't mine and wasn't Ernest's, but that had our town's angles, neat and a little overconfident. There was also a little photograph, the kind a cheap camera takes in a corner, showing a back turned to the camera, a thick jacket, a familiar slouch. I knew that slouch as I knew the grain of our porch planks. "Where did you get these?" I asked. Doris didn't answer at once. She pressed her lips together, and the sound she made was like a key in a lock. "A woman who cleans the funeral home found them in the trash," she said. "She thought maybe they were meant to go to someone else. She couldn't do anything herself. She gave them to me and said she didn't want me to be alone." I smelled Ernest in everything, oil, the rainy wood under the bench, but there was something else now that followed me like a second shadow. The idea that someone had reduced his life to paper transactions before they'd reduced it to a date. The envelope in my lap felt like a challenge. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. I meant the woman who'd thought to save what she could, the woman who'd slid those copies into Doris's hands, the friend who'd come to a bench at the track when I had no plan. We walked back toward town together, our shoes making the same soft sound on the path. Doris spoke in the way friends do when they have been given a truth too heavy for a single palm. She told me who'd left the papers, what the woman at the funeral home had said, something about how she had seen a man take a box labeled office away the afternoon after the accident, and that the man had been in a hurry and had looked like he wanted to be elsewhere. The woman had thought nothing of it until the funeral, until the woman called to tell Doris she couldn't sleep. It was the small thing that turned the world, a name on a receipt, the curve of a signature in ink that tried to look like ours. The town was a place that could excuse a fur to hand. "He's been under stress," people said. "Boys will be boys." But things compounded, and patterns are harder to ignore when you keep tripping over them. We took the papers to Stephen that afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table, the light in the window making his notebook look like a field guide. He moved carefully, as if dealing with old photographs. He listened to Doris tell the woman's story, and then he asked in the way he always did for facts, not emotion, dates, times, names. He folded the photocopies and put them with the ledger and the recorder. When we left, his face had that tight, determined set that men get when they are about to make something public. It did not take long after that for the town to start rearranging itself around what might be true. Sergeant O'Connell came to the house with a quiet gait, the kind of gait that carries both duty and neighborliness. He had been there the day I found the ledger. He had been the person Ernest had told me to call. He did not move like a man asking for headlines. He moved like a man who had been told a neighbor's house was on fire and wanted to know if anyone was still inside. We handed over what we had, the ledger, the photocopied receipts, printouts from the bank. The recorder, its plastic, small and humbling on the table, sat like a relic. O'Connell ran his thumb over the edge of the recorder as if to reassure himself it was solid. "It's a start," he said. "We can get warrants. We'll need more than hearsay, though." He had to be careful. He had to follow statute and not rush without probable cause. But the small town had an advantage. People remembered the way you signed your name, the cadence of your voice, the routes you took to the hardware store. When O'Connell made his calls, his voice carried the weight of the town with him. He got officers to look through surveillance from the hardware store, to cross-check credit card purchases, to call the life insurance company and ask polite, pointed questions. Every step forward felt like moving over broken ground. There were moments of sweetness, neighbors bringing casseroles, a woman from church leaving a doily on my porch. But those same hands were the ones who could also look away if it made them comfortable. Still, the town could not unsee the ledger and the receipts. They were factual, dull as stones, and when you throw stones into a pond, they make ripples. Stephen found more than he promised. He had ways of listening and eyes for the paper trails. He came to me with the folder that had been taped shut like it held something fragile. Inside were copies of phone records that showed calls made from the shop's line at odd hours, credit card slips that aligned with receipts in the ledger, and a bank transfer that had gone out the week before Ernest's accident. The handwriting on insurance documents had been traced back in careful analysis to one of the son's known signatures, with enough difference to suggest imitation, not perfect forgery, but a hand trained to look familiar. Still, the town could not unsee the ledger and the receipts. They were factual, dull as stones, and when you throw stones into a pond, they make ripples. Stephen found more than he promised. He had ways of listening and eyes for the paper trails. He came to me with a folder that had been taped shut like it held something fragile. Inside were copies of phone records that showed calls made from the shop's line at odd hours, credit card slips that aligned with receipts in the ledger, and a bank transfer that had gone out the week before Ernest's accident. The handwriting on insurance documents had been traced back in careful analysis to one of the son's known signatures, with enough difference to suggest imitation, not perfect forgery, but a hand trained to look familiar. There are enough pieces, Stephen said, and he sounded both tired and relieved. If O'Connell can tie the purchases to a substance that the medics could mistake for an accident, and if we can show a motive around a sudden financial need, that makes a case. I remember thinking of Ernest at his bench, patient, methodical, the kind of man who would not leave a loose screw. He'd known the sound of people hiding things because he had listened all his life, to the creak of an axle, to the sigh of a bolt. For him to have hired Stephen before he died was, for me, an admission. He had been wary. He had put down a breadcrumb trail and hoped someone would follow it. The medical examiner's office, a bureaucratic place where light is bright and smell neutralizes memory, agreed to do preliminary tests. They had been dismissive at first. The accident had looked like an ordinary fall, but the unusual purchases and the way Ernest's symptoms had been described changed things. O'Connell pushed. He is a good man who knows how to ask in a way that is not threatening, but persistent. When an autopsy was recommended, I felt the practical blade of grief sharpen into something like duty. Exhumation is crude in its formality. It is a legal unmaking that the living demand of the dead to show what's been done. There is no easy way to describe exhuming someone you love. The ground had settled where they'd lowered the cedar lid. We watched as men moved with mechanical gravity, unwrapping a life to see whether someone had decided to make it end sooner. I stood with Doris and Stephen and the cop and felt very much like a spectator to a private clinical theater. The lab results, when they came, were careful and medical and precise. There was methanol in the samples. Methanol is a cruel, unpoetic thing. It is solvent, it is industrial, it is a number on a page that translates to a human ending. It had been found in concentrations that were incompatible with life. The report was clinical and cold. Under the signatures and stamps was a truth I had been trying to make sense of. This had not been a fall. When the forensic report sat on the sergeant's desk like a piece of weather, it changed the mood in the realm. O'Connell made the calls he needed to make. The district attorney, with the patient gravity, characteristic of people who move slowly but with effect, took the file. Judge Miller read the complaint, O'Connell filled his badge with pride and sadness, and a warrant was drawn. Arrests are like closing a book on a chapter that refuses to end. They come at dawn a lot because dawn has the advantage of catching people off guard. I remember the morning the police came for Charles and Henry. I was at the shop because the shop still smelt of my husband, and because sometimes the rituals we have are the only places grief can be practical. They arrived quietly, O'Connell at the lead. They moved with respect to the house where I'd raised 2 boys. But law is not sentimental. Charles was taken without a public struggle. He sat like a man who'd practiced indifference. And Henry looked at me with the hollowness of someone who might be realizing, for the first time, the breadth of the thing he'd been dragged into. Jasmine watched from the doorway with a face carefully blank. The arrest made the town hum. People whispered. Some said I was wrong. Some said I should have seen it. The truth is the kind of thing that is often obvious only after someone points to the proof. For a moment, in the bright, strange publicness of being an accused man's mother, I felt the old protectiveness flare and then be quieted by a new thing. I owed Ernest the truth, and I owed the truth to myself. The trial was a small, terrible spectacle. We sat in a courthouse that smelled of polished wood and coffee. The district attorney laid out the evidence in a way that was steady, not dramatic. The documents, the bank records, the receipts, the lab report. Stephen sat beside me like a solid thing, his hand on mine when the prosecutor played the recordings in court. The recorder's voice, grainy, flat, human, filled the room. The audio was played with the same modesty that had marked the rest of the case. Not a dramatic crescendo, but a factual, damning clarity. There was that line again, the one that had lodged in me like a splinter the first time I heard it. We have to make sure he doesn't wake up. When it played in the courtroom, people leaned forward, as if the sound itself had weight. Charles did not look at me when the recording played. He looked at the table and tapped his foot. Henry covered his face with his hands. I did not want to look at my boys as defendants. I wanted to see them as the children who had once stood on the porch holding a jar of marbles. But the record is a thing that strips nostalgia away and leaves you with what you can prove. The defense tried the usual, that the recordings were hearsay, that the purchases could have innocent explanations, that these were sons who loved, or at least had loved, their father. But the ledger, the bank transfers, the insurance increase, and the lab results braided together into a pattern too strong to be a coincidence. The policy, taken out in a week when certain signatures appeared that were not quite like ours, hung over everything like a motive you couldn't ignore. Dr. Albright's pretextual evaluation came under scrutiny for being too convenient. His name, an uneasy politesse in our small town, fell into the same place as other small hypocrisies. I testified. The act of stepping into the stand felt like stepping onto a plank above a cold river. I spoke about Ernest's handwritten note, if anything, call O'Connell, and about the attendance at the funeral, the insurance increase, the way the boys had been distant, and the ledger I had found in the false bottom of his desk. I did not speak with the theatrical anger some wanted. I spoke the way Ernest had always taught me to speak, plainly, with the small care of someone handing over the right wrench. I wanted the jury to see not a woman bent on revenge, but a widow trying to help the law do its job. The hearing was long. Evidence took its slow, aching time to make itself known in plain light. Witnesses came forward, neighbors who remembered odd deliveries, the funeral home worker with the heart to save a couple of photocopies from the trash, the bank teller who'd grown suspicious, and small pieces clicked like safe tumblers. The prosecutor laid out the case with the patience of someone threading beads on a string. The defense tried to unravel the lace with loose threads of doubt. When the verdict came, the courtroom felt like a held breath. The jury filed in, faces taut with the memory of what they had heard. One by one, the jurors wrote their names, and then the words that would change the time of our lives. Guilty. The word had a weight I had not expected. It did not bring joy. It did not bring vengeance. It brought, in a way I could not have anticipated, an emptiness that was less violent than the one that had lived in me for months. It meant the law had upheld the facts. It meant I no longer had to be the only one carrying the suspicion. Charles received a sentence that the judge read with solemn attention. Henry's sentence came with a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation that a doctor took seriously. The law did what it could within itself, which is to say, it pronounced judgment and tried to account for human fracture. After the verdict, Charles avoided my eyes. He looked like a man left to himself in a room without a window. Weeks after the trial, I learned that Charles had taken his life. They told me in the sterile way people tell you things they do not want to linger on, by phone, in a list of facts. The shock of the news jarred me the way a sudden cold wind jars a sleepy person. I felt a grief as complicated as any knot. The son I had loved fiercely was dead, but the man the law had found guilty had chosen to leave in a manner that denied me the usual rituals one expects. There was no easy motion to this grief. It was as if one beast had been caged and another had been shot at the gate. I cried for both, for the boy with the grease on his knees, for the man who had planned in darkness, and for the hole left in the place where both had been. Henry was committed to a psychiatric facility. He was not the same person who had once brought me coffee on slow Sunday mornings. The last time I saw him was through a glass partition, his hands pressed flat, as if trying to feel a story on the other side. He murmured apologies that were not entirely for me. They were apologies for a life he had not kept together. I sat with his eyes and had that old parental ache for someone who had lost their way. The town reacted with the complicated mix of judgment and sorrow small places feel when a family unravels in full. Some people avoided me in the grocery store. Others brought casseroles without asking. They did not know what to do with me. I did not know what to do with myself. I had to learn to move in two contradictory directions at once, to mourn my sons, both the living and the dead, and to hold Ernest's memory clean from the expenditure of crimes cooked to look like accident. I found myself thinking of Ernest's hands often then, the way he would tuck a rag under a spoke so a wheel would not wobble, the small rituals a man builds in order to make a life. I thought of the phrase he had written in the ledger and the small act of courage required to tuck a private fear into a public place, to plant a seed of suspicion like a caution for the future. For him to have done that made both his fear and his faith clear. He believed in a world where paperwork and proof could outlast secrecy and menace. After the dust settled, I did not become a stone. I refused to be hollowed by the noise. The insurance money came. It arrived as a crisp, incriminating thing that belonged to Ernest and to me, and, now that it had been touched by our son's actions, to a story bigger than our family. Many people told me what they thought I should do. Keep it, they said, because it was the money meant to put a life to rest. Give it away, they said, because the money was made ugly by its origins. I thought of Ernest's hands again and of his insistence that a thing be put to right. It was not a decision I took lightly. I asked myself what Ernest would have wanted. This was a habit of mine, to let his sense of practical ethics guide me like a compass. He would have wanted the shop taken care of. He would have wanted the boys' liabilities. I thought of gambling debts and whispering men at back tables. But he also would have wanted the small sense of community to be mended. The idea that rose in my chest then was not revenge, but repair. I used part of the money to create a foundation in Ernest's name. the Hayes Foundation for the Protection of Elders and Families at Risk. It made a small public record out of private harm. We gave grants to families who couldn't afford guardianship, helped pay for legal consultations for older people who were being pressured, and funded community seminars in the library about the signs of financial exploitation. We paid for guards at the community center to make sure elderly folks had safe places to store paperwork. We opened a small helpline. It was modest and imperfect, but it carried a direction. Turning the shop into a garden felt right. Ernest had loved his tools, but he loved the idea of hands making the world better most of all. I donated the bicycles that were left to the school and put planters where the old workbench had been. The garden was a place people came to sit and talk. Doris planted the first rose bush by the window and named it for the years Ernest had run the shop. Stephen brought seedlings sometimes, elbows dusty from his own life of work. I found that the garden, more than anything, stitched things back together in ways I had not known to ask for. The foundation also became a way to teach the town what to watch for: small withdrawals, sudden insurance increases, the sort of polite deception that looks like care but has a sharpness at its core. We ran workshops about how to keep paperwork safe, how to read bank statements, how to spot the subtle signs that someone might be trying to push an elder into decisions. People came, sometimes skeptically, sometimes ashamed that they had not seen sooner. We spoke of boundaries, of how love is not the same as consuming someone else's autonomy. I wrote letters to the district attorney and to Judge Miller, not to persuade them, but to thank them for carrying a burden that had been heavy and necessary. I planted a memorial in the garden with Ernest's name and the phrase he had always liked: fix the small things so the big things don't break. It felt like closing a circle without pretending that closure had the final say. There were days that were tender and days that were sharp. I had to explain to grandchildren that the world could be complicated when it came to money and family. I found that people I had once counted on became cautious around me, as if the story might stain them by proximity. But I also found something I hadn't expected: a chosen family, the kind that forms when ordinary folks decide to stand with someone not because they're related, but because it's right. Doris and Stephen and a few neighbors became that for me. We had dinners that were simple: soup and bread, and the sort of talk that does not demand performance. We would sit sometimes in the garden in the long afternoons and tell stories of Ernest: how he once fixed a rusty bell and surprised a little girl at the inn, how he taught a young man in town to trust his hands. The legal aftermath had other costs. The doctor implicated, Dr. Albright, faced professional scrutiny and a suspension that left him small in the town's gossip. The son's fates remained complex and painful. For all the talk of justice, there was no magic that made things neat. In the quiet hours, I missed the boys who had eaten fries at the fair and fallen asleep on our couch with their shoes on. I had to hold in my chest both that tender memory and the cold reality of what they'd done. I learned to separate love from a refusal to be safe. Loving someone does not mean letting them take from you. Loving someone includes saying no when what they ask matters to your core survival. I teach that now in the seminars at the foundation. You can love and you can also set a boundary. That idea has been a quiet kind of revolution for some people. They'd never been taught that. Many elders, when you ask them, say that they thought love included a kind of surrender they now see made them vulnerable. Years passed. The garden grew, the foundation's helpline answered calls from towns beyond ours, and the press, when it came, wrote about the small woman who refused to take a rumor for an end and instead demanded proof. They liked the simplicity of that headline because the world likes a tidy narrative. The truth was messier. There were dark nights, apologies that had no audience, and visits to places I did not want to go. There were, too, small joys: an apple pie at harvest time, a child learning to ride a bike in the shade of the oak, the odd letter from someone thanking the foundation for helping them spot a problem before it became a calamity. I go to the grave sometimes, not because it is necessary. Ernest's ashes are in the ground with a small stone, his name carved in plain letters, but because ritual steadies me. I plant flowers in the spring and sweep the path in the autumn. I tell him about the foundation, about Doris and Stephen, about the roses that bloomed the summer Charles died. I tell him the small, true things he would have wanted to hear: that we turned a shop into a garden, that someone brought bread when there was none, that we taught people to watch for signs of shadow. When people ask me whether I forgive, the question sits like a small stone in my mouth. Forgiveness is not a tidy curtain you can pull to make wrongs vanish. For me, forgiveness is a long work. Sometimes it is a moment when I can think of Henry as a child without collapsing into anger. Sometimes it is a decision to not spend the rest of my life trying to make the dead fit into the outline of what I wanted. Forgiveness for me is more about refusing to allow my life to be only reaction. It is about holding a boundary and then living inside it. There are nights I still wake and hear the recorder's hiss, and sometimes I fumble for my phone and read the old message again. I'm alive. Don't trust our children. It is a sentence that once felt like a cudgel. Now it is a sentence that sits like a question I keep answering. When I repeat it in my head, it is no longer a call to suspicion only, but also a reminder that truth can come from strange places, and that sometimes, in the middle of your darkest hour, an anonymous voice will hand you a lantern. People have asked me why I didn't handle things privately, why I didn't let the pain stay at home. The answer is simple and small. Private sorrow can be a trap. When secrecy covers harm, it gives harm a place to live. Ernest's life mattered. His death deserved more than silence. The public measure of the case meant that others might not have to sit where I sat, trusting what they loved without knowing the edges. I have made mistakes. I have bargained with grief and lost. I have, too, learned to accept help. That small lesson is perhaps the largest gift of all: to allow others to hold you, to know when to hand the wrench over and when to take it back. I have married prudence to affection and found a kind of peace in the marriage. On the anniversary of Ernest's death, I walk to the bench at the track where the letter asked me to meet. I sit and sometimes watch children racing bikes, their shouts like bright things. I bring a thermos with coffee and, if the day asks for it, a small slice of pie to leave on the bench like an offering. I think of the message that came at the funeral and of how a single line of text can make a life rearrange itself. I press my finger against the bench's flaking paint and speak Ernest's name. The phone vibrates sometimes with solicitors and with old neighbors telling me the garden looks lovely. Once, on a quiet morning, it buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. For a moment I felt that old reflex, my heart hitching at the hint of revelation, but it was just a catalog. I laugh now, quietly, at the way my body remembers the sound like a second pulse. The house is quieter than it used to be, and that quiet has given me a space to breathe. If anyone asks what the most important thing I learned from all this is, I say this: truth matters, and love with boundaries is the kindest love. To protect your life is not to stop loving, it is to keep the container your love lives in intact. I plant roses and fix small things and make sure the foundation answers the phone when someone calls frightened. I keep Ernest's notebook in a drawer where I can reach it. Sometimes, when the day is long and my hands ache from work in the garden, I take it out and read his neat handwriting and remember the man who taught me that small things matter. The message that landed on my phone at the funeral, "I'm alive, don't trust our children," arrived like a splinter in a world that had been flattened by grief. It made me lean in. It made me watch. It made me do what Ernest would have wanted, to look carefully at the small things and, when necessary, follow them until the full truth could be seen. If you find something in the margins of your life, a receipt that shouldn't be there, a signature that is off, a loved one who seems smaller than they once were, listen. Ask questions. Keep your papers where you can find them. Hold on to the ones who will help. You do not owe your safety to anyone. Love, but hold a line. If this story has touched you and you want to learn more about elder protection or find resources, the Hayes Foundation maintains a list of support services and legal contacts that have helped many families find footing. Visit the Foundation's page for information on how to spot the signs of financial exploitation and how to get immediate help. Share this with someone you love. You may be the very person who notices what others miss. The message that landed on my phone at the funeral, "I'm alive, don't trust our children," arrived like a splinter in a world that had been flattened by grief. It made me lean in. It made me watch. It made me do what Ernest would have wanted, to look carefully at the small things and, when necessary, follow them until the full truth could be seen. If you find something in the margins of your life, a receipt that shouldn't be there, a signature that is off, a loved one who seems smaller than they once were, listen. Ask questions. Keep your papers where you can find them. Hold on to the ones who will help. You do not owe your safety to anyone. Love, but hold a line. If this story has touched you and you want to learn more about elder protection or find resources, the Hayes Foundation maintains a list of support services and legal contacts that have helped many families find footing. Visit the Foundation's page for information on how to spot the signs of financial exploitation and how to get immediate help. Share this with someone you love. You may be the very person who notices what others miss.